So now, okay, let's get started. So this is the fourth session we're going to go over today. We're going to go over user management. Okay, so learning objectives for today, we're going to look at how to understanding the different user roles in Zeit Manager. We're going to look at how to create new user roles in Zeit. We're going to look at a specific feature called focal areas, which exists under the reviewer role in Zeit Manager, how to edit and customize user information, and finally, understanding responsibilities for user management in the software, in the program, as an IM or as a PM even. So we have 5 chapters today, and let's get started with the first one, which is Introduction to User Roles. So Zeit is structured with different user roles. So anyone who has access to Zeit will have some form of a role within Zeit. And those roles are displayed here in this chart at the bottom. So you have viewers, you have editors, reviewers, and manager. So all user roles have a particular scope of access. That could be based on specific sites, it could be based on regions, or it could be based on site types. We'll go over that a bit more in some of the coming slides. Okay, so the first role we're going to look at is the role of a viewer. So here we have probably the lowest level of access. And in this role, essentially what you'll be able to do is you can view cases and site information. So you can look through the project in Zeit. However, you're not given the option to edit case data or site data. You're not able to review any information related to cases, and you can't go into project settings. So this one you can probably think about as very often you'll have people, colleagues who might want to gain more of an understanding of Zeit. So you want to give them access to be able to view the project pages. Maybe they need to take some information out of it, but you don't want them to be able to input any data. So in those instances, you would provide them with the user role of a viewer. So the next role we'll look at is an editor. So the editor will essentially, outside of being able to view the cases within their scope, they'll also be able to submit and edit cases. So that essentially means to submit forms, so surveys within their scope, so within their geographic area or within the sites assigned to them, and they'll also be able to edit those forms. However, they won't be able to review case information, so that essentially means that they're not going to be able to change the status, add comments, or edit any of the custom fields inside of the cases. So now let me just go through, in case it's not clear, what the difference is between the idea of submitting and editing a case and reviewing the case information. So as always, we'll go into our project. Essentially, if we just go into any of the sites. Okay, so to submit a case, you would submit a form over here. So as an editor, you'll have the ability to do that. You'll be able to go into a form that you've submitted, and you'll be able to edit it over here as well. This tab to the right is what's called the review panel. So over here is the options which you won't have as an editor, but you will have in the next role that I'll discuss, which is as a reviewer. Okay, so this is the next role as a reviewer. So here, as with the role of an editor, you can submit and edit cases within the scope. And at this stage, you'll also be able to review all of the case information within that scope. So that means you can add comments to a case, as you just saw in the previous part. You can change the case status. So the regular case statuses are open, in progress, responded, and flagged. And you will also be able to add custom fields as a project manager. And so you might have different custom fields, such as reason, for example, and you'll be able to change those custom fields if you have the role of a reviewer also. So for the role of a manager, there are a few different levels to what a manager means on Zeit, and you have to be cognizant of those when you're giving users different permissions. So a project manager essentially has full permissions of the entire project. So in that instance, they'll be able to add sites, remove sites, change regions, edit sites, delete cases, and also do bulk operations. And by bulk operations, we mean the bulk upload of sites, for example, but bulk upload of cases, or even a huge edit. A site manager will have full permissions of the relevant sites, but not of the entire project itself. So that might be useful if you have a person who's working on your project and is a manager, but maybe a manager only for a specific region. So let's say the east of a country, and then they would be the site managers for the entire east of the regions, but they won't have those same permissions for the other regions within the country. So the other two sub roles within manager we have are user manager and report manager. These I'll go through in the next slide over here. So these you can think more about as managers with respect to data management. A user manager essentially can add users to the project. They can also edit the users, but they're not able to assign any other permissions, nor do they have control over the cases in Zeit. So a report manager can create and share reports with users, but they can't manage other project settings. So those would essentially be able to go into Zeit. They could create a data set. They could share that data set with other users, but they're not actually the people submitting the cases themselves. So essentially, they'd be managing the data end of the project, but not necessarily the actual inputs into that project. So the final part in this section, there's also a real importance and added value to assigning multiple roles. So usually you will have multiple roles for every user that works in Zeit. For example, you might have one user who works for Acted. They might need viewer roles for the entire project, but should have editor roles for Acted sites only. So that means they'll be able to view everything that goes on in the project. But since they're only working in sites managed by Acted, let's say, they would have editor roles, so they'd be able to submit and edit cases in those sites only. So this can be done either at the start where you assign roles, or those roles can be edited. That's a very simple process, so you don't need to worry about it getting it all perfect at the start. You can always edit those in the process. Okay, so now we'll just go over creating new users. So you have 3 ways to create users to projects, and you find them all in the same workspace offsite. So the first role is to assign a role. So that essentially you give a role to an existing user within Zeit. The second way is to send an invitation. So this essentially sends an email invitation to a user that invites them to join the project. That's probably the most common way you'll be inviting people to use Zeit. And the third is to add a user manually. So in this instance, you would essentially select the username, you'd select the password, and then you'd give those login details to the person and they'd log in directly. So now we're just going to go through a very quick demo of how we would assign a role to someone. And for this, we'll just use the email invitation role because I think that's the most frequent one that will be used. In this instance, we'll go, as always, to our project settings. We can go into user and user list. And over here, we'll click on this button here, which is assign role. So over here, you'll see the 3 methods to assign roles or assign a user. So the first one is to assign a role, second, send invitation, and the third is to add users manually. So we can click on this one, for example, and we would put the email of the person that we want to join. Over here as well, you can put multiple emails. So here I've just put one. We'll click on continue. And then over here, we have a view of where and what we want to assign to that person. So we'll go to the second tab here. This is a view over here that will be updated soon. But for the moment, the easiest way to use this function is to use the right-hand side, so region and site types. So here you will select the role. So let's say for this one, I will give the person an editor role, and that would be in the region of the entire project. And you can also filter by site type. So as we mentioned in a previous session, the site types can be quite flexible. So site types, you might have the organization working within the site or managing the site. That's what we have in this example. But you could have a range of different things for how you'd want to organize your project. So over here, let's say that we want to just put acted, and we would send that invite. So in this instance, I've already done this before with that person, so they already have an invitation to the Zeit platform. But essentially, they would receive an email that looks something like this. It would be very simple for them to go in then and just accept the invite, and they'll see the different levels to which they have access. They'd accept that invite, and then they'd be on Zeit. Okay, so this is just a reminder for the moment until this part is updated. You'd want to use the second part here. It's much easier to use to send the email invitation. So you'd be selecting the role and then you'd invite the person by the role, the region, and the site type. Okay, so the next part is to edit existing users. So you will have a user list. You will navigate to settings, go to the user list. You can manage the role to remove or add roles to user profiles. And under edit, you might also be able to edit user profile information. You can also delete the profile in this part, delete the user. We'll come on to the importance of that. But before you do that, you have to also delete the user roles associated with that user. So just to quickly look into that. We have the user list over here for this project that we're working on. We can go into edit and manage role, and we'll see the roles that they have. Let's take someone else, actually. Let's look at this. Okay, so here we can see that there are project reports manager in this project that we're working in right now. We could remove that role potentially, and we could also assign a new role. So we might have that. We also want them to be a project viewer for the entirety of that project as well. So then we'd have another role assigned to them here. And just as easily, we can click on this button to remove the roles. And if we remove all of the roles, then we would also be able to delete them from the system, which we might want to do, let's say, if the person has left the organization. Okay, so here we'll start to look at creating focal areas. 2 seconds. Okay. So focal areas are a type of user which exists under the category of reviewer. So this is a very specific part of a user role. It essentially allows permissions to only a specific category of cases and tickets. So as an example of how this might be useful, you could have a protection program reviewing, let's say, referral forms or reporting related issues from a safety audit form. Or you could have the shelter focal point only managing shelter-related referrals. So essentially, in this case, the person who is the focal reviewer will only have access to those protection forms, or if they were a shelter reviewer, would only have access to shelter-related referrals. So essentially, it's a mechanism by which we can give very, very specific access to a certain type of programmatic person on Zeit. Without giving them access to the entirety of other information. So in order to create a focal area, what you'll need to do is go to users, focal areas, and you have two small things to input. That would just be the focal area ID, that would be the primary key, and the focal area name. So that will be what you would see as the label for them. So once that focal area is created, you can then assign a user to that focal area. And as said before, focal areas are in the reviewer category. So if we remember from the previous slides, the reviewer category gives a person the ability to edit and submit cases, but also to look into the case information. So to add comments, change the status, and edit custom fields there. So this, you can imagine, is especially useful for processes where you have a flow. So something like a referral mechanism, you might have a referral that goes to protection, that they can be automatically notified of that referral. They can view it directly in Zeit, and they can indicate on Zeit whether they've actioned that referral or not. So they can click, okay, I'm now reviewing this case, it's in progress. They will change the status to in progress, and that will go back to the CCCM team. So it's very, very useful in creating automated workflows and giving people very specific access. This will be covered in more detail when we actually go through in another lesson cases and workflows, because this is essentially where it would come up the most. In this presentation, in this training, we're really just going to be looking at how it's set up in terms of the user list. So I will just show quickly how to assign these focal areas. So from the top, we'll go into projects, we'll go into settings, and over here under users, we've looked at the user list, and now we have focal area. So let's say over here, we would add the focal area. So we have a protection focal area. We might also want a shelter focal area. So we'll give it an ID and we'll give it a name. So now you have another focal area to which you can assign a role. So you would go into your user list after you've created that, and you would search for the person who is working for Shelter, who needs only access to Shelter specific referrals and cases. And there, let's say it's this viewer, and you would manage the role, and you could assign a new role to them. And within that role, you would be able to also see under reviewer, we have the two specific focal areas for reviewer. So if you click just reviewer, you'll get a blanket reviewer role. However, if you click just the shelter, that person will only have access to those shelter cases. So this is a really, really useful feature, and will be utilized quite a lot in your work. So just to go over some of that again. So the focal areas don't necessarily have access to all the cases within the project. So creating the role doesn't give access to all of the cases automatically. The focal area essentially depends on workflows that are created. So if cases are automatically referred to Shelter, then that person will be notified and they would see the cases in Zeit, or potentially also in their email inbox as well, because that can be automated. The other way outside of an automated workflow is if a user manually refers cases, but essentially the focal reviewer is based upon people referring cases to them. So an example of a focal area, so we've gone through this, a CCCM team refers cases directly to protection team. The protection team is given that access and they're automatically alerted to any protection related referrals, but they won't be able to see other cases or referrals related to that site. Okay, so next we're going to be going over user information. So essentially this is just a descriptive field that can be accessed by the settings and then going into user information. So this here we can control, create new custom fields for what appears in a user's profile. So as with always, you'd have some default fields and then some custom fields which you can add on depending on your project needs. So the default suggested fields that exist at the start are the name, gender, phone, email, and address. Some of those are optional. You don't have to put them in. The only thing that's required is the name. You can also enable or disable some of these default user information fields. So custom user information fields are recommended to include. Again, depends on the needs of your specific project. They might be useful to track extra details based on the specific project that you're doing, and they can be set as mandatory or optional when you set those things up. So some of the best practices you might have are the user organization, program, or unit that the person is working for, or the related activity or team. So we can just switch over to the demo now, so we can have a look at how you'd add that. So we go into settings, and over here we have user information. So we can see that we have two which are required fields, and here are the suggested ones which exist at the beginning of your project. We could also create a custom field over here. So you might have a lot of different units working within your project. So you want to have that clear in the user list. So here you'd create custom fields, and you might put in unit for your custom field. And for type, you would want to have a single select. And where you have a single select, you would then add the options. So let's say you have shelter, and you have protection, and you have wash. So you'd also potentially make this field required, and then you'd save. So now whenever you have a new user, you'd also have this custom field, which they would need to fill in. Okay, so exporting user information, you can export all of the information related to the user profile. So that's all of the fields we just covered in the previous slide, including custom fields. As well as how active the user is via two methods. The first will be by the reports feature. That will be covered in much more detail in a future session. And the other way is just to take a raw CSV export, and there we just go into the same link that we've been going to, so the settings and then user list, and then you essentially can just directly download the CSV. So we'll just have a look at how we can do that now. So here we're in the same page as before. We go into user list, and right over here we have a download button, so we can just download the user list over here. This will give us a CSV, and that CSV will essentially just look something very basic like this. It will have the username, the email, if that's already set up, active. So some of these won't be active. And that's important information to be able to check on. Date joined, and all of the fields that exist over here. Okay, so now we're going to go over user management. So when you have your list of all of these different users, and some of you will be working on projects that have gone on for quite a long time, you'll have very expanded lists with lots of people. And that will also contain lots of personal, private information that we don't want to share publicly in any way. So here we need to ensure that access is essentially limited to only the people that that are working with us, and that the managing of that user access is a key responsibility of the programs and of all of the managers and information managers in that program. So essentially, your project is responsible at the core level for the user management. So this means that it will be really important to regularly review by checking the user list, which I just showed you, who has access to the project, the the permissions and roles of each user, so to check whether those still apply. Someone might have been a project manager at a certain point and now no longer requires those functions and is working a bit more as a project editor or project reviewer. In those instances, you'll need to change the permissions and roles, and whether access is relevant and required. So some people might have access for a certain amount of time, change to a different department, and in those instances, you'll need to ensure that you remove access for those users in the list. So this is the criteria that we would suggest for removing users. So this would be to keep the platform manageable and also to reduce the risk of any unauthorized access. So if anyone leaves the organization, it's really important that they're removed from Zeit straight away. If they change roles, they don't need access anymore, then they should also be removed from Zeit. And if they're inactive on Zeit for more than 60 days, then they should also be removed because it's a clear indication that they're not using the program and they need to go off. So an important note over here is that whenever you're in doubt about one of these factors, it's very, very easy to remove access and add a user's access back. So it doesn't take much time. It's not a big issue. So whenever you're in doubt, just remove the user's access and just presume that if they email you and say, I need access to this thing again, then you can do that very quickly and easily. Okay, so shared accounts, this is something which happens sometimes, but is prohibited, and we need to ensure that everyone has their own account when they're using Zeit. So it's very bad for data protection, so it's because it's hard to understand who's doing what. In Zeit, one of the features of Zeit is that we can essentially track and understand what activities are being done by which users, which forms are being submitted and edited, and that can help us in our workflows and managing users. When you share accounts, it can be difficult to track those things and can be bad for data protection. So it's also bad for general management of operations data. So as just said before, it's hard to understand how to follow up with certain people who took action. So someone might have left a comment. It would then be impossible to know who left that comment if there are shared accounts going around. And also generally bad for user management in terms of information and user metrics. So as said before, it's very, very easy to set up users and user permissions. Always just ask for your own user account and try and hold off from any sharing of accounts. So in terms of user management and the responsibility of regularly reviewing access, as shown in one of the previous slides, it's very easy to download the user list. And within that user list, you can see login dates that are very, very old. And you can also see inactive accounts. So one of the fields that you'll see, one of the columns, is the date of the last login. So you can always go into that column and you can just check by that. If it's someone that was last logged in 6 months ago, then that's a clear indication that they can be removed from the their user profile can be removed. Okay, so this is an important slide just to look over whether everyone needs users and permissions. So user management can sometimes get messy, especially with projects, certain projects that have been running for a long time. So you end up with a lot of users, and it can be important sometimes to remind yourselves that not everyone needs to have a user and specific permissions. So the access is really important for people working in the field, managers and program officers. It's used essentially needed, the access is needed to collect and manage information. So also for administration, user and site management. But if you're someone that needs information from Zeit, other units, for example, but they still need regular CCCM information on they need regular CCCM information. They don't necessarily need login details to Zeit. It's not important, and it won't necessarily have an added value. So if people need data, it can be much easier to share this through APIs and through Excel. So this can be really easy to set up, and you can have a conversation with the person to get an understanding of what data they require. It can be very easy to set up an API, so they'll have direct access to what they need from Zeit, and they don't actually have a user access to Zeit itself. So really important to keep that in mind and consider whether you need to set up a user profile for someone or whether it's easier just to provide them with access to data.